She came to Montana looking for silence. A retired soldier, tired of wars that never really ended. Grace Walker bought an abandoned cabin for $600, hoping only to find peace. But the first night, her old German shepherd, Max, began scratching at the stone fireplace, whining, trembling, as if the fire itself was whispering her name. What they uncovered beneath the hearth wasn't a ghost. It was evidence of a truth someone had killed to bury. A storm was coming, and not just from the sky. This is a story about courage, loyalty, and the light that still burns beneath the coldest ashes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, bravery, and the quiet miracles that refuse to die. The wind moved like a ghost through the valley, thin, sharp, and endless. Snow danced in slow spirals across the courthouse steps of Flathead County, Montana, where Grace Walker, age 35, stood clutching a single sheet of paper that felt far heavier than its weight. Her breath rose in small, white clouds. The deed read, North Fork Cabin, purchase price, $600. A signature marked her new beginning, or perhaps her next mistake. Grace was a woman built of discipline and quiet endurance. Tall and slender, her frame carried the poise of years in uniform, though her face betrayed the fatigue of battles both fought and remembered. Her hair, a muted chestnut brown, was tied back neatly under her wool hood, strands of it escaping to brush a cheek turned pale by the Montana cold. Her eyes, gray-blue, restless and searching, carried the faraway stare of someone who had learned to trust silence more than words. At her side padded Max, her 9-year-old German shepherd. He was a striking creature, his thick black and tan coat dusted now with snow, and his movements calm but alert. The town knew him from the years Grace had served. Max was once a military service dog, retired but never truly at rest. His ears flicked at every sound, his amber eyes sharp yet kind, the eyes of a guardian who had seen too much. Together, they made a quiet, watchful pair, two survivors in need of purpose. Inside the courthouse annex, murmurs followed her as she left. People didn't mean to whisper cruelly, but fear wrapped around that cabin like old ivy. "That's the Miller place," one man said. "Haunted," another muttered. "Cursed land." Grace heard, smiled faintly, and kept walking. Cursed land was still land, she thought, and $600 was a small price for solitude. By late afternoon, her truck creaked along the snow-drowned road that wound through pine forests toward the mountains. The windshield wipers beat a rhythm against the white silence, and the radio hissed with static. Grace's gloved hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The storm was building. Fine snow thickened into flakes, flakes into curtains of white. Max shifted in the passenger seat, his breath fogging the glass. "Almost there, buddy," Grace murmured, her voice low and steady, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. The road narrowed into a trail, half buried beneath snow. She recognized the landmarks from the county map, the split pine, the rusted fence post, the empty mailbox whose red flag still pointed stubbornly toward the sky. When she finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The North Fork cabin stood alone at the clearing's edge, its roof bowed beneath decades of snow, its log walls darkened by time and moss. The single window was clouded with grime, and the porch sagged slightly, emitting a weary groan under the weight of the wind. Grace parked and Tom stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cold bit through her boots instantly. Her first impression was not fear, it was familiarity. Abandonment had a smell, a stillness she knew too well from battlefields long emptied of sound. "It's just us now," she whispered. Max trotted ahead, sniffing the air, his breath rising like smoke. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and old wood. She opened the shutters. Weak daylight spilled in, illuminating the small space. A table, 2 chairs, a single bed frame, and in the corner, a massive stone fireplace. Grace ran her hand across the mantel, leaving a streak through the dust. "You've been waiting a while," she said softly. The place wasn't haunted, she decided. It was lonely, like her. She unpacked her small bundle of supplies: a lantern, a can of coffee, a sleeping bag. She lit the oil lamp, its glow trembling against the walls, and then gathered kindling. The match hissed as it caught, flame blooming in the darkness. Warmth began to breathe back into the room. But Max wasn't calm. The dog had been quiet all the way up the mountain, yet now his body was rigid, tail low, ears tilted forward. He stared directly at the fireplace. Grace frowned. "Easy, boy," she said, setting down the lantern. He didn't move. His chest rose and fell faster, a soft whine slipping from his throat, a sound she hadn't heard since Afghanistan. It wasn't fear. It was warning. Grace crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked. Max's fur bristled beneath her fingers. He sniffed the hearthstone, then pawed lightly at the edge of the lowest slab. A dull, hollow thunk echoed back. Grace froze. Her mind, once trained to separate panic from logic, began to stir with both. The sound didn't belong. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the groan of frost. It was deliberate, solid beneath hollow. She pressed her ear close to the stone. Silence. Only the faint crackle of the fire answered her. "Probably air under the floor," she said aloud, more to herself than to Max. But her heart had quickened. Years of training had taught her that sometimes the smallest sound could mean the difference between safety and danger. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees, pressing against the cabin walls with ghostly persistence. Snow hissed against the window like dry sand. The lamp flickered as if the air itself was tightening. Grace stood, rubbing her arms against the chill. "We'll look tomorrow," she said, though her gaze kept drifting back to the stone hearth. Max didn't move from his post. As the night deepened, the world outside disappeared into white silence. Grace sat by the fire, boots off, staring into the flames. The warmth should have comforted her, but it didn't. The flames burned steady, yet somewhere beneath them she imagined hearing it again, a faint knock from under the hearth. Once, then again. Her pulse quickened. The sound was soft, almost uncertain, like something trying to rise from the frozen earth. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Grace reached for her lantern, eyes fixed on the fireplace. The wind moaned through the chimney, carrying a note that almost sounded like a whisper. She whispered back, barely breathing. "Who's there?" The fire flared suddenly, scattering sparks across the stones. Grace blinked, and the sound stopped. Just the howl of wind, the hiss of snow. She stared at the hearth for a long moment, until her reflection in the glass door of the lantern began to tremble from her own heartbeat. Outside, the storm roared like something alive. Inside, Grace sat motionless beside her dog, the faint echo of that knock still buried somewhere between the fire's warmth and the earth's cold silence. And for the first time since she bought the cabin, she wasn't sure if she was alone. The morning broke gray and thin, the kind of light that barely bothered to rise. Snow still fell in soft, slow flakes, dusting the pine branches outside the cabin. Inside, the air was brittle with cold. The fire had long died down to embers, but Max hadn't moved from his spot in front of the hearth. His black and tan fur shimmered faintly in the dim light, his posture rigid yet strangely patient. Ears perked, eyes fixed on the same patch of stone he had guarded all night. Grace Walker woke to the sound of his low, steady breathing. It was the rhythm of loyalty, the heartbeat of an animal that knew before the human did that something wasn't right. Grace sat up, her back stiff from sleeping on the old cot. The air smelled of smoke and iron. For a moment she simply watched Max, wondering if her unease was just exhaustion or if she was starting to absorb his instincts. Her training as a soldier had taught her one truth: silence is never empty. It's waiting. She pulled on her thick olive coat, the one that still smelled faintly of sand and oil was from another lifetime, and crouched beside the dog. "What's got you so fixed, huh?" she murmured. Max flicked his tail once but didn't look away. Grace brushed ash off the stones of the fireplace. Her gloved hand paused where the mortar darkened oddly between two slabs. She frowned. The color was wrong. Not the dry gray of old grout, but a damp black, pliant to touch. Curious, she took out her multi-tool knife, the same one she'd carried since her deployment in Kandahar, and scraped lightly along the seam. The edge sank easily into the softened mortar. "That's not supposed to happen," she whispered. Max's low growl vibrated in the floorboards. Grace steadied her breath. "All right," she said softly, more to the air than to him. "Let's see what secrets you've been sleeping on." She pried gently at the discolored stone. The slab shifted with a faint crunch, sending up a puff of cold, dusty air. Beneath it yawned a hollow cavity, square, about 4 feet deep, lined with river rock. The air that rose from it was old, dry, and tinged with metal. Her pulse quickened. She angled the lantern closer and saw a small olive-green metal box, military issue, the kind used for field equipment. Beside it, half buried in dust, lay a leather-bound notebook and 2 small sample containers, one filled with cloudy water labeled with coordinates, the other with dark soil sealed in wax. A folded map was wedged under the box lid, its paper brittle and yellowed, but the ink still clear. Red circles, dozens of them, scrawled across a hand-drawn topography of the valley. Grace's breath caught. "What the hell?" she whispered. She reached for the notebook. The cover bore a faded name in block letters: Daniel Harper. She froze. The name was familiar. Back in her first year after discharge, she remembered hearing something on the local radio: an investigative journalist missing for 15 years, presumed dead after tracing illegal dumping sites in Montana's mining district. She remembered the case being quietly dropped, buried under bureaucratic noise. She opened the first page. The handwriting was meticulous, sharp, deliberate. Dates, coordinates, names. Notes about North Ridge minerals, citations of environmental violations, corporate buyouts of local landowners, sudden floods and landslides conveniently erasing contaminated evidence. Some entries were stained, others torn, but the patterns were clear. A deliberate poisoning of the valley's groundwater, and a chain of cover-ups reaching high above any small-town jurisdiction. Grace sat back, rubbing her temple. The cabin creaked as the wind pressed against it. "So, this is what you found, Max," she muttered. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if he understood. Grace smiled faintly, a dry, humorless curve of the lips. "You just can't let me rest, can you?" But beneath the sarcasm, a spark had ignited, the same sharp focus she hadn't felt since wearing a uniform. She carefully closed the notebook and placed it beside her. Her mind spun. If this is true, someone hid it here. The thought made her glance toward the window. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving a white stillness that magnified every sound. The tick of cooling metal from the stove, the slow creak of timber, and then an engine. Grace's head jerked up. Through the frosted glass, she saw a faint flash of blue-gray light moving between the trees. Headlights. Seconds later, a knock at the door. Sharp. Controlled. She opened it to find Sheriff Harlan Briggs standing in the snow. A man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, jaw dusted with silver stubble, and eyes the color of polished coal. His uniform was neat despite the storm, his badge gleaming faintly in the pale light. But his smile, thin, precise, didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Ms. Walker," he said, voice gravelly yet polite. "Heard you bought yourself the old Miller cabin. Thought I'd stop by, check if everything's all right. Big storm last night." Grace nodded slowly. "I've seen worse." He glanced past her shoulder into the cabin. His gaze lingered a second too long on the fireplace, then shifted back. "Lot of stories about this place, monsieur," he said casually. "You be careful up here alone." "I'm not alone," she replied. Max stood beside her, head level with her hip, silent but unmistakably watchful. The sheriff's lips twitched. "Fine dog," he said, stepping back. "Just keep the doors locked. Weather can make folks act strange." "Stranger than usual?" Grace asked dryly. Briggs chuckled, but his eyes never left hers. "You'd be surprised." Then he turned, boots crunching through snow, and climbed into his patrol truck. Grace watched until the taillights disappeared down the trail. When the sound of the engine finally faded, she exhaled. "That wasn't a visit," she muttered. She stepped around to check her truck. Her gut told her what she'd find before she saw it. The rear tire slashed clean through, edges crisp as a warning. For a long moment, she just stared, wind biting at her cheeks, then laughed once, short, bitter, but not hopeless. "Welcome home, Grace," she said quietly. Max pressed his head against her leg, tail low, waiting. She looked down at him, her expression shifting, less weariness now, more resolve. "They hid this for a reason," she whispered. "We're going to find out why." Max gave a small bark, as if in agreement. His breath curled like smoke in the frozen air, and for the first time since she arrived, Grace felt something unfamiliar flicker behind her ribs. Not fear, but purpose. She turned toward the cabin, toward the quiet fire still burning over the stone that once hid its secret, and smiled faintly. "Let's wake up the ghosts, boy." The storm arrived without warning, swallowing the mountains whole. By dusk, the sky above Montana had turned into a heaving mass of slate-gray clouds, the kind that erased both horizon and time. Wind lashed through the pine trees, snapping branches and scattering ice like shrapnel. Inside the North Fork cabin, Grace Walker sat hunched over a flickering laptop screen, her breath fogging in the chill air. The weak signal light blinked green, then red, then green again, barely holding through the snowstorm. Her fingers, calloused and steady, moved with the precision of a soldier defusing a mine. On the table lay a stack of damp documents and scanned photographs. Geological reports, bank transfers, and environmental warnings stamped confidential. Each bore the same name in the corner: North Ridge Minerals. Grace's jaw tightened. She knew what corporate sin smelled like. It was always sterilized, printed on clean paper, then buried under the snow of bureaucracy. She clicked send, routing the encrypted files through a private network. On the other end of the line was Megan Jensen, a former colleague from Grace's brief, chaotic post-military stint as a security analyst. Megan had once been a war reporter before turning to investigative journalism. She was in her late 30s, sharp-featured, with copper-red hair she always tied into a messy bun, and a voice that carried caffeine and sarcasm in equal measure. Her sense of humor was armor, her courage almost reckless. Through the static, Megan's voice crackled. "Grace, I got your files. You sure you want to go public with this? You'll piss off the wrong kind of people." Grace's lips curved in a dry half-smile. "I already did that when I bought this cabin." There was a pause. Megan exhaled audibly. "Fine. 06 Huntwag check-in. If you don't call, I forward everything to the Bureau. No dramatics, okay?" "No promises," Grace replied softly. The line went dead. Grace leaned back, the chair creaking beneath her. Her reflection wavered in the dark window pane, pale face framed by loose brown hair, fatigue etched beneath her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt not the numbness of solitude but the tremor of purpose. She looked down at Max, her German shepherd, who lay by the door like a sentinel carved from fur and breath. 9 years old, his coat a dark swirl of black and tan, eyes deep amber that caught every flicker of movement. He was her radar, her anchor, her last soldier. "Sleeps off the table, huh?" she murmured. Max raised his head slightly, ears twitching toward the west. He emitted a low growl, not loud, not fearful, just a warning, the kind that lived in the blood of wolves before men tamed them. Grace's instincts sharpened. She killed the lamp, plunging the cabin into a gray half-darkness lit only by the fire's orange pulse. Outside, the wind carried faint crunches, snow shifting under boots. Grace's hand went to her pistol on the table, a .45 she had kept since deployment. She moved silently to the window, her breath steady. The forest beyond the clearing was no longer still. Shadows moved there, slow, deliberate, too coordinated for hunters. Max's head turned toward the east now, a short whine. Grace understood it like Morse code. 1 west, 1 east, 2 approaching. She crouched near the door, lowering her heartbeat until it matched the rhythm of the storm. "You've been here before," she reminded herself. "Different country, same kind of night." The next sound was almost delicate. A metallic click, the whisper of a lock shifting against itself. Then silence. Grace turned just as the rear window cracked open. A figure slipped through, wrapped in dark fabric, face hidden beneath a snow-dusted hood. The intruder's hand moved toward a holstered weapon. But Max was faster. The dog launched forward, a blur of muscle and fury, jaws clamping around the man's wrist before he could draw. A shout cut through the storm. The gun clattered to the floor, firing once. A flash of light. A hole in the wall. Grace was already moving. She kicked the weapon aside, wrenched it up, and fired a single shot into the doorframe. Warning, not panic. The thunder of it filled the cabin. Outside, a voice rose over the wind, cold and sharp as breaking glass. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Ms. Walker." The tone was smooth, commanding, the kind of voice used to giving orders from behind expensive desks. Grace recognized it instantly from a dozen interviews and press clips. Silas Cole, CEO of Northridge Minerals. Late 40s, tall, broad-chested, always seen in tailored suits and silver cufflinks that reflected studio lights. His public charm was legendary. His cruelty, whispered about in mining towns. Grace shouted back, "That depends. Do you usually send your lawyers or your hitmen?" A pause. Then the voice again, mocking, closer. "If we can't have it, we'll burn it." Something shattered. The hiss of glass, the smell of fuel. A lantern had been knocked from its hook. Oil spread across the floorboards like a hungry tide. Flame followed greedily, climbing the walls. The cabin roared to life, light and shadow colliding. Max barked once, sharp and commanding. Grace coughed through the smoke, pulled the dog close, and dropped low to the floor where the air was still breathable. Heat licked at her skin. Through the haze she could make out silhouettes outside, 5, maybe 6 men forming a semicircle beyond the flames. Their rifles gleamed like a ring of black teeth in the snow. "Well," Grace rasped, half laughing through the adrenaline, "guess I should have bought a fire extinguisher." Max pressed against her leg, hackles raised, ready for another command. The flames burst upward, glass exploding outward as the windows blew from the heat. Grace wrapped her arm around the dog's neck, took a breath, and kicked the back door open with everything she had left. Cold hit like a wall. She stumbled into the snow, one side of her jacket seared black, the other glazed white with frost. The contrast was almost absurd, half fire, half ice. Behind her, the cabin burned like a funeral pyre. She dropped to one knee, gasping, the world spinning between orange and white. Max stood in front of her, body rigid, shielding her from the armed silhouettes closing in. Snowflakes melted on his fur, hissing like rain on iron. "Easy, boy," Grace whispered, clutching the pistol tighter. Her breath plumed like smoke. The storm howled louder, carrying the smell of burning pine and fear. And through it all, Max didn't flinch, standing tall, a shield of living warmth between his master and the cold, unblinking dark. The world was burning and freezing all at once. Snow swirled through the flames like dying stars, and the forest roared with both wind and fire. Grace Walker could barely breathe. Every inhale carried smoke and ice. Her vision flickered between blinding orange and merciless white. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder, one sleeve scorched black, the other crusted with frost. Her right hand still clutched the pistol, though her fingers trembled from exhaustion more than fear. She could hear Max panting beside her, each breath rough and alive. He stood protectively in front of her, a streak of black and tan against the snow, her last shield in a world of collapsing light. Then she heard it. Thump, 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 the low, rhythmic beat of rotor blades. At first, she thought it was her heartbeat. Then the sound grew, deeper, nearer, cutting through the storm like a promise. She looked up. Through the veil of snow, a faint circle of light began to break the night apart. Search beams carved across the mountain ridges, slicing through the smoke. Grace's heart lurched. "You kept your word," she whispered hoarsely. Megan Jensen had always been a woman of her word. Even when chaos was her companion, she was the kind who showed up. Grace could almost see her now, in some Denver office, red hair and a messy bun, pacing between monitors, phone in hand, demanding to know if her friend had survived the night. Megan's tenacity had always bordered on recklessness, but it was the kind of recklessness that saved lives. Grace smiled faintly, the kind that hurt to make. "You crazy woman," she murmured. The helicopter's spotlight struck the clearing. State police markings flashed across its side, followed by a second chopper with a darker insignia: FBI. Ropes dropped from the air like veins of light, and black-clad figures descended, their boots sinking into the snow with synchronized precision. Orders were shouted, short and clear. "Secure the perimeter! Weapons down!" The mercenaries who had surrounded the cabin hesitated. Their silhouettes wavered in the snowstorm, the orange glow of the fire painting them like ghosts. One of them, the same man Max had mauled inside the cabin, dropped his rifle and raised both hands. Another followed, then another. Fear spread faster than loyalty when the law finally arrived. And then came Silas Cole. He stood a little apart from the others, his once immaculate black coat singed at the hem, his hair disheveled by the wind. Even now, his posture was defiant, shoulders squared, chin lifted, as if he could still control the narrative. His face, usually composed for cameras and shareholders, was drained of color. The snow clung to his lashes, melting instantly against the feverish heat of his skin. He looked around, as though the landscape might bend to his will, but there was nothing left to command. Only fire, ice, and consequence. Grace watched as two FBI agents approached him. One was tall, with sharp cheekbones, and a trimmed beard, his voice calm but firm. "Silas Cole, you're under arrest for environmental fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Silas gave a hollow laugh, one that broke halfway through. "You think you know what's under that dirt, Agent?" The man didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but she does." He turned toward Grace. She stood shakily, Max pressing against her leg for balance. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes bloodshot but alive, eyes that had looked death in the face too many times to be impressed anymore. She pointed toward the smoldering ruins of the cabin. "The real evidence," she said, voice raw but steady, "is under the hearthstone. A box, metal, olive green." An officer jogged forward, calling into his radio. Within minutes, two men in protective gear knelt by the remains of the fireplace. They worked quickly, pulling aside charred wood until the stone base appeared. The slab was lifted, and there it was, the box half blackened but intact. One of them opened it carefully. Inside were the items Grace had risked everything for. Small sample vials marked with coordinates, soil and water evidence, a leather-bound journal, and the map covered in red circles. The air seemed to still around them. Grace sank to her knees in the snow, fatigue washing over her like the tide. The world finally stopped moving. Around her, voices crackled over radios. Names were confirmed, charges listed, orders issued. Even Sheriff Harlan Briggs, who had once smiled so politely, was being led away in handcuffs, his badge glinting weakly under the searchlights. The list of arrests grew longer by the minute, stretching through local deputies, county officials, and board members, an entire winter's worth of corruption melting into daylight. But Grace wasn't watching anymore. She was staring at Max. He had settled beside her, his fur steaming slightly from the lingering heat. His muzzle rested on her thigh, eyes half closed, tail thumping once. soft, tired, content. She reached down, brushing her soot-covered hand along his back. "You did good, partner," she whispered. Around them, the forest burned low and slow. The first hints of dawn bled through the storm clouds, a pale pink breaking through gray. Smoke curled upward like incense from a prayer finally answered. Grace tilted her head back, eyes tracing the thin line where darkness met morning. For the first time in years, she felt the weight in her chest ease, not gone but changed. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from surviving. A medic approached, young, freckled, voice gentle. "Ma'am, you need to sit still. You're burned." Grace gave a half smile, shaking her head. "I've been burned worse." Her voice cracked on the edges of humor. "But thanks." The medic nodded and moved on. Grace looked once more at Max. He was watching the sunrise, too, his ears twitching in rhythm with the distant thump of retreating helicopters. Together they sat in the snow, their breath mingling with the morning light. "Looks like we made it," she said softly. Max's tail moved again, a slow, reassuring beat. They both laughed, quietly, weakly, but sincerely. The sound was fragile, carrying the scent of smoke and the taste of relief. It rose into the cold air, merging with the sound of the wind and the dying crackle of the fire. For once, the world didn't answer with violence. Only silence. Only peace. And in that silence, beneath the first blush of dawn, two survivors, one woman, one dog, sat together, smiling as the light found them again. Spring came quietly to Montana, as if apologizing for the winter. The snow retreated in slow sighs, dripping from the eaves of the pine trees, revealing patches of green like old memories surfacing through time. In the clearing where the North Fork cabin once stood, Grace Walker worked with the calm precision of someone who had finally stopped running from ghosts. Her hands, though scarred and rough from the fire, moved steadily, arranging stones, stacking wood, rebuilding what had been lost not as it was, but as it should be. Grace wore a flannel shirt under a faded army green vest, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her brown hair, now sun-streaked and shorter from being singed in the blaze, brushed her shoulders as she bent to lift another stone. Her skin had regained color, a healthy flush replacing the pallor of exhaustion. But her eyes, those blue-gray eyes that had once carried the hollow look of a soldier without a cause, now held warmth. Not fiery, but steady, like coals that refused to die. Beside her lay Max, sprawled in the half-shadow, his fur glinting in the pale morning light. The old German shepherd was slower now, his movements stiffer, his muzzle peppered with white. But his presence filled the air with peace. He had earned every scar on his body and every line of gray in his coat. His tail flicked lazily whenever Grace hummed under her breath. "Don't give me that look," Grace said, setting a final stone into the foundation. "You're the one who started this whole mess." Max huffed, closing his eyes, his chest rising and falling like a tide. Grace smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know. I'd do it all over again, too." The land around them had changed. The rivers once poisoned by North Ridge's waste now shimmered clear under sunlight. The first shoots of green moss climbing the banks. News cameras had come and gone weeks ago, their trucks carving tracks through melting snow. The networks called her the hero of the Hearth. Grace still found that ridiculous. When a young reporter from Channel 5, a woman barely out of college with nervous hands and hopeful eyes, had asked, "How does it feel to be a hero?" Grace had smirked and pointed to the dog lying at her feet. You're looking at him. I just paid the mortgage. The girl had laughed awkwardly, not sure if it was a joke. It wasn't entirely. Grace had chosen to stay in Montana when the others left. The Bureau offered her a relocation, witness protection, even counseling. She declined all of it. You can't protect someone who's already stopped hiding, she'd told them. What she wanted wasn't safety, it was roots. Now, on this quiet morning, she was building those roots one stone at a time. The new fireplace was made from river rock, smooth and mottled with veins of quartz. Each piece she lifted carried the memory of ice and flood, and she liked that. The idea that even broken stones could find new purpose when set together. She poured a final line of mortar, wiped her brow, and stepped back. The hearth stood there, simple but strong, catching the first breath of wind like it was alive. Grace crouched beside it, running a finger over the topmost stone. No secrets this time, she said softly. Only warmth. The door creaked behind her, old wood salvaged from the cabin's remains. Inside, the new structure was small, but cozy. A single room, a modest kitchen, and a loft bed. On one wall hung a simple wooden board, etched with the words Grace had carved herself. Homes are built from trust, and sometimes they begin with a dog's nudge. That night, when the fire finally burned in the new hearth, Grace poured 2 mugs of cocoa, one for herself, one left cooling beside Max's bowl. More tradition than necessity. The flames danced gently, painting the walls gold. Max snored beside the rug, a deep, rhythmic sound like soft thunder. You snore louder every year, Grace teased, poking at the fire with an iron rod. The forest spirits probably think it's a storm. He didn't stir, only groaned in his sleep, tail thumping faintly. Grace laughed under her breath. The sound was different now, lighter, younger somehow. She hadn't laughed like that since before the war. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last remnants of snow caught the moonlight. Beyond the tree line, the wind carried the faint scent of pine and riverstone, mingled with wood smoke. Grace leaned back against the chair, the warmth soaking into her bones. The house creaked as if exhaling too, a living thing made from the ashes of another. In that stillness, Grace felt something stir, a pulse not of fear or adrenaline, but of belonging. Maybe this is what redemption sounds like, she thought. Not loud, not glorious, just quiet and earned. She reached down, resting a hand on Max's head. His ear twitched, his breathing steady. We did good, didn't we? She whispered. Now let's see if we can stay out of trouble for once. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks into the chimney. Grace closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the wind lull her. For the first time in years, there were no alarms in her head, no ghosts in the dark corners, only peace, and the quiet heartbeat of a rebuilt life. Outside, dawn crept over the valley, painting the snowmelt gold. The rivers ran clear, the pines swayed gently, and above it all, a hawk traced circles in the sky, its wings catching light like a benediction. Max stirred, lifting his head as if hearing something distant. Grace opened her eyes and followed his gaze toward the hearth. The firelight flickered, reflecting in his eyes. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. He didn't bark, just looked at the flames with quiet awareness, as though he'd heard a story whispering beneath them. Grace smiled. Maybe the world's not done talking yet. The wind carried the scent of pine and ash through the open window, rustling the carvings on the Chawtown door. Somewhere in that whisper, life continued, new, imperfect, and deeply, beautifully alive. And in front of the fire, one woman and one old dog stayed awake just a little longer, guarding the warmth they had built together. Sometimes, God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes, He sends them with fur, scars, and eyes that still believe in us, even when we no longer believe in ourselves. Grace thought she had bought a broken cabin for $600, but what she truly received was a miracle, a reminder that even from ashes, faith can rebuild warmth, that forgiveness isn't weakness, but the way we learn to breathe again. Maybe that's what God wanted her and all of us to understand. We don't find miracles in grand gestures or shining lights, but in the quiet moments when love decides to stay. In the hand that rebuilds instead of destroys. In the loyal heart that refuses to give up, no matter the storm. So tonight, if you're watching this, and life feels like winter, remember, the fire still waits beneath your ashes. And maybe, just maybe, God has already placed a Max beside you, someone or something, to remind you that His love never leaves. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because in this community, we believe that faith still walks beside us, that love still saves, and that miracles still rise from the coldest silence.